Hello and welcome. So this is going to be a lore reading. We're going to see what we learned by, let's see, wandering the wastes east around Lothering and getting into Kirkwall and figuring out one of the two ways we're going to be able to get into Kirkwall. Hurlock. Taller than their Genlock cousins, which we haven't actually found out about. The Hurlocks are roughly human-sized but are possessed of considerable strength and constitution. The shock troops of the Darkspawn, I think that would be the ogres. A single berserking Hurlock can often be a match for numerous opponents at once. They are also known to adorn themselves with roughly carved tattoos. I didn't think tattoos were carved. To keep track of their kills and deeds, it seems to indicate that they're more than just mindless beasts, but anyway. Though it is unknown whether or not there's a uniform standard to these markings. Towering over their Darkspawn kin, the massive ogres are a rare sight in the battlefield. Traditionally, they only appear during a blight, but some records claim that ogres have been spotted in the deep roads hunting alone or in small groups. At least one report by a Grey Warden claims an ogre was spotted alone in the Kokari Wilds in 919 Dragon, though it was weakened and easily dispatched. Up to 100 of these creatures can accompany a Darkspawn horde at any one time during a blight, often using their great strength to burst through fortifications and demolish the front lines of an opposing army. They use brute force to charge their enemies like bulls, slam the ground, and with their fists shake enemies off their feet, and hurl giant rocks into the face of oncoming foes. Melee can be difficult against a giant that snatches a warrior up in one hand, crushing the life out of him, or beating him into oblivion with the other hand. Yeah, at least in Origins, I'd frequently have an issue with that happening, and as such, I used to keep at least one person with them to have something to stun the ogre with, because when they're stunned, they put you down, and that's a lot less distressing than watching helplessly as your character is getting beaten into oblivion. The Nimble can try to wriggle his way free, or an ally can attempt an array of stunning blows on the ogre to free the comrade in danger. Grey Warden lore urges caution when slaying an ogre unless it is ensured that they have received a major wound to the head or the heart. It is possible they are lying dormant and will regenerate to full health within a matter of minutes. During a blight, most Grey Wardens recommend burning all Darkspawn to ashes, dead ogres in particular. Kirkwall, the Gallows. Statues of tortured slaves fill the gallows courtyard, a ghastly memento of Kirkwall's history. 1,500 years ago, Kirkwall was the Imperium's largest quarry, feeding the construction of the Imperial Highway. The Imperium's hunger for expansion led to legions of slaves forced into working the quarry. When the Empire's construction phase ended, I think that'd be never, but Kirkwall slid naturally into its new role as the slave capital of the slave trade, the gallows at its heart. The statues are not monuments to the suffering of slaves. Every inch and angle of the courtyard was designed by the magisters bent on breaking the spirits of newcomers. Yeah, understand that is something that was done, particularly in the ancient period, like designing buildings to be imposing, to basically be like, hey, don't challenge this city or this ruler because look at the massive architecture I can command. And executions here took place daily, sometimes hourly, and corpses were hung from gibbets throughout the yard. New slaves trudging in from the docks saw what awaited them. When Our Lady turned her armies against the Imperium, the slaves of Kirkwall revolted and claimed the city for themselves. The gallows stood empty for 200 years, not to be reopened until the crowning of divine Justinian I. The gallows transformed the city again when the abandoned prison tower became the home to Kirkwall's Circle. From in Pursuit Knowledge, Brothers of Tree Scholar, Brother Janet TV. I admit I find it kind of incredible that if revolting slaves took over the city, that they would actually leave the statues I mean, the symbols of their oppression, would they actually leave those in place? I feel like they probably would take those, like, take them down and destroy them, and probably melt them down and turn them into something else. Or, like, during the 200 years that followed, that the metal wasn't looted, and, like, the gallows themselves weren't looted for materials to build other structures, because that's kind of what happened with most old structures. Abandon a castle and people start quarrying it for stone. Kirkwall once lived on the edge of the Demeter Imperium as home to nearly a million slaves, stolen from elven lands or shipped from across the sea. Yet all slaves fed the Imperium's unquenchable thirst for expansion. They worked in massive quarries and sweltering foundries that produced stone and steel for the Empire. So I'm not sure what, like, medieval or, like, ancient foundries were like, if they even really existed. And also, something that kind of bothers me with a lot of fantasy settings is that the technology never seems to develop. I mean, sure, there's magic, which can make up for a lot of what we use for technology in our world. Magic can make that, so the technology doesn't need to progress as quickly. But, like, the Demeter Imperium is supposed to have been overthrown, like, about a millennium ago? And they're still just using steel at that point? I mean, yeah, it just seems like, there should be a past point when they're using, like, bronze or copper or stone tools. I kind of feel like fantasy is missing, like, pre-medieval stuff. Just, yeah. Why is all fantasy medieval? I mean, sure, there is some stuff. I think there's Seven Seas, which is, like, Renaissance. That's fantasy. And there's, like, modern fantasy stuff where we've got magic in the modern world. But I don't really know that much about, like, there being, like, Iron Age, like, Roman, like, Bronze Age, Age of Fantasy settings, because for some reason it's not as interesting. The city's complicated past is not easy to forget, history having earmarked many corners of the stoned city. A ship approaching the harbor spots the city's namesake, an imposing black wall. It is visible for miles, and carved into the cliffside are a pantheon of vile guardians representing the old gods. Over the years, the Chantry has effaced many of the profane sentinels, but it will take many more years to erase them. The Chantry has had, like, most of a millennium to do that. Also carved into the cliff is a channel that permits ships into the city's interior. Flanking the channel are two massive bronze statues, the twins of Kirkwall. The statues have practical use. Kirkwall sits at the narrowest point of the waking sea, and a massive chain net can be erected between statues and lighthouse, closing off the only narrow navigable lane. The stranglehold on sea traffic is jealously guarded by the ever-changing rulers of the city as the net trawls taxes, tolls, and extortions in from the sea. From a pursuit of knowledge, the travels of a Chantry scholar by Brother Channel TV. I can honestly see that not lasting all that long, because it's one of the things that I think nations don't really like. They don't particularly like their merchants being, being extorted. The Kokari Wilds. It is said that in the midst of the Black Age, when werewolves stalked the land of Ferelden in numbers that kept every farmholder indoors and a hound on every doorstep, a powerful Arl of the Almari people stood and declared that he would put an end to the threat. His Arling stood on the border of the dark forest, just on the southern border of the Ferelden Valley, and he claimed that the werewolves used the forest to launch their midnight assaults on humanity. For 20 years, this Arl led an army of warriors and hounds deep into the forest. In his hunt for werewolves, he slew not only every wolf he came upon, but also every member of the chastened wilder folk. Any one of them, he said, could harbor a demon inside, and thus be a werewolf in disguise. For 20 years, the forest rang with the screams, and the rivers ran red. Tales say an old chastened woman found her sons all dead at the Arl's blades. She pulled out one of the very blades from one son's heart and plunged it into her own chest, cursing the Arl's name as she did so. When her blood touched the ground, a mist began to rise. It spread and spread until it was everywhere in the forest. The Arl's army became lost, and it is said they died there. Others say they wander still. The ruins of his Arling stand to this day, filled with the ghosts of women who wait eternally for their husbands to return. The forest of legend is, of course, the Kokari Wilds. There are as many legends about the great southern forest as there are shadows, or so the saying goes. The chastened wilder folk have made their homes there since mankind first came to these lands, and the wildlands spread as far into the south as anyone has ever ventured. Beyond the mists, there are vast tracts of snow, white-capped mountains, and entire fields of ice. The land is too cold for mankind to survive, yet the chastened eke out an existence even there, and they tell of horrors beyond the wilds that the lowland folk could not begin to comprehend. To most, Ferelden simply ends at the Kokari Wilds. There is nothing beyond. The wilds is a land of great trees, wet marshes, and dangerous monsters. What more needs to be said? From The Land of the Wilders by Mother Alice, for the Chantry Scholar, 918 Dragon. Yeah, that is a thing which I feel like we have some difficulty in the modern world understanding, is that I feel like the pre-modern world did not usually have clean borders. It was more like zones of influence which slowly faded out. So you have further from the center of power, the less able the ruler is to actually exert their influence and enforce their laws. So, in this case, might have some influence in the Kokari Wilds, but the further you're from, the civilized centers, here's the cities, the less influence they're going to have. An honest answer regarding apostates. A mage who does not receive the teaching of the circle and who doesn't have the words of Andraste in her heart is an apostate, and a danger to us all. Without the guidance of the holy chantry, a mage may foolishly dabble in the darker arts, blood magic or demon summoning, and thus become maleficarum, and a mage's mind will ever be a doorway to spirits of the fade. Without proper instruction, this doorway remains open and unsecured. If a demon should come through this doorway and possess a mage, an abomination is created. Abominations know only madness. They cannot be reasoned with, and will slaughter men, women, and children. And without thought, whole cities have fallen to these creatures. Thousands have died at their hands. And the Chantry and her Templars have a duty to ensure that this does not happen. If I knew a better way to deal with magic, I would seize upon it immediately. You say we should let mages guard themselves, but I tell you that is no solution. Look at Tevinter Imperium. Their magisters do not know restraint without the Chantry oversight. The magisters abuse their power. Those without magic are trampled underfoot and forced to serve. Slaves are slaughtered by the hundreds to feed the magisters' hunger for power. Even some mages are not spared, for in mages, as in humans, there exists a spectrum. On one end, the very powerful, on the other, those who can barely light a candle. The Empire cares only for the strongest, and those who do not compare favorably are thrown to the wolves. Imagine your children growing up in such a world. If a mage asked of you, you would have to give him your daughter, not knowing what his plans for her might be. You could not resist him, and neither could she. Without our Templars and without the Circle, the common man would have no defense against magic. We must deny mages certain freedoms for the common good. I wish there was some other way. I tell the apprentices that this is a test of their faith, that it is the will of the Maker. Many understand that we do what we do for their own good. Excerpt of a letter from Grand Cleric Francesca of Starkhaven to Lord Guthrie Abholtz. Yes. Apostates. Very dangerous. I mean, sure, Wynne probably killed a bunch of people, but I mean, no more than the rest of the party. Darkspawn, those who sought to claim heaven by violence destroyed it. What was golden and pure turned black. Those who had once been mage lords, brightest of their age, were no longer men, but monsters. Therionides 12:1. Sin was the midwife that ushered the Darkspawn into this world. The Magisters fell from the Golden City, and their fate encompassed all our worlds. For they were not alone. No one knows where the Darkspawn came from. A dark mockery of men. In the darkest places they thrive, growing in numbers as a plague of locusts will. In raids, they will often take captives, dragging their victims alive into the deep roads, but most evidence suggests that these are eaten. Like spiders, it seems Darkspawn prefer their food still breathing. Perhaps they are simply spawned by the darkness. Certainly, we know that evil has no trouble perpetuating itself. Yes, I mean, certainly we don't know where Darkspawn come from, how they reproduce. The last blight was in the Age of Towers, striking once again at the heart of Tevinter, spreading plague into Orlais and east into the Free Marches. The plague spread as far as Ferelden, but the withering and twisting of the land stopped well beyond our borders. Here, Darkspawn have never been more than the stuff of legends. In the northern lands, however, particularly Tevinter and the Anderfels, they say Darkspawn haunt the hinterlands, preying on outlying farmers and isolated villages, a constant threat. From Ferelden, Folklore and History by Sister Petrine, Chantry Scholar. Carver Hawk. Carver Hawk grew up surrounded by magic he couldn't truly understand. He cared deeply for his family, but sometimes felt like the stupidest person in the room. Carver foundered in loathing, caught between the gifts of his apostate sister Bethany and the growing skills of his more focused sibling, Marion. But even as Carver groused about his lot, he remained dedicated to protecting those he loved. He didn't think twice about sacrificing himself to save his mother during the flight from the Darkspawn, and although Carver struggled to find his way in life, there was gratification in knowing his death had purpose. Flemeth. You are required to do nothing, least of all believe. Ages ago, legend says Ban Conobar took to wife a beautiful young woman who harbored a secret talent for magic, Flemeth of Highever. And for a time they lived happily until the arrival of a young poet, Osen, who captured the lady's heart with his verse. They turned to the Chazen tribes for help and hid from Conobar's wrath in the wilds until word came to them that Conobar lay dying. His last wish was to see Flemeth's face one last time. The lovers returned, but it was a trap. Conobar killed Osen and imprisoned Flemeth in the highest tower of the castle. In grief and rage, she worked a spell to summon a spirit into this world to wreak vengeance upon her husband. Vengeance she received, but not as she planned. The spirit took possession of her, turning Flemeth into an abomination, a twisted, maddened creature. She slaughtered Conobar and his men, and fled back into the wilds. For 100 years, Flemeth plotted stealing men from the Chazen to sire monstrous daughters, horrific things that could kill a man with fear. Yes, Morrigan was definitely horrific. These Kokari witches led an army of Chazened from the wilds to strike at the Elmari tribes. They were defeated by the hero Cormac, and all the witches burned, so they say, but even now the Wilders speak that Flemeth lives on in the marsh, and she and her daughter steal those men who come too near. Morgan's mother saved the last Grey Wardens from death at the top of the Tower of Ishal, but just who or what Flemeth truly is a mystery. Marion Hawke. The daughter of Malcolm Hawke and Leandra Amel, Marion has lived in many places throughout Ferelden. Her father and younger sister, Bethany, were apostate mages. As the family was constantly on the move, avoiding Templar hunters, 10 years ago, the family settled in the village of Lothering, building a home on the outskirts, and making a life where they wouldn't have to be on the run forever. Though Leandra constantly worried that the Templars would one day catch up with them, Malcolm kept his abilities a secret and taught his daughter to do the same. He died 3 years ago, leaving Marion responsible for the welfare of her mother and younger siblings. When the Blight began, Marion and Carver quickly enlisted in King Caelan's regiment. Just a regiment, not the army. The horde spilled from the Kokari wilds meant their home would quickly be overrun if the Darkspawn were not defeated immediately. However, the Battle of Oscar ended in the betrayal and death of King Caelan. Marion and Carver barely escaped the chaos with their lives, returned to Lothering to get their mother and Bethany out with only moments to spare. And that's it for this one. And thank you for watching. Do any relevant things with YouTube's buttons, and have a nice day.